just to remind you, the paragraph that begins, now that which is arising. Oh, is that what I want to be? Yeah. So that's it. He just mentions two arguments, you see. I read that paragraph. Now, that which is arising does not arise due to the non-existence of arising apart from the arisen and the unarisen, and because it follows there would be two arisings, one in consequence of which it becomes the arising, and one in consequence of which it is said to arise. Yeah, sounds a bit complicated, and it is a bit complicated. But we had a look at the first one, no arising, due to the non-existence of arising apart from the arisen and the unarisen. So I tried to talk about a little bit of that about that one last week. And it's like, is there arising in any of the three times? Basically, is there arising? If you advance it like Nagarjuna, there is no arising, because there is no arising of the unarisen, no arising of the arisen, or the unarisen, or the arising, just like it says in the verse. So all the three times, there's no arising in any of the three times, basically. So that's what we've been looking at last week, and I said this week we'd look at end note number 2, which is where I kind of try to express it the way I understood it. I still feel there's something elusive there that I haven't probably kind of pinned down. It's not quite satisfying. I feel like there's some loose ends or something that I haven't, some ambiguity or something I haven't quite pinned down or fixed up or whatever. So we just have to explore it. And then what comes after in the next paragraph in Budapalita's text here, that's quite relevant to the first argument, the one that we're in the middle of discussing. So when we read end note number 2, we can come back and look at Budapalita's remarks. But basically, I think they've talked about it before in earlier chapters, so they aren't going to sort of spend so much time on it here, just as it is in the verse. It says we've talked about this when we're talking about the chapter on going, the examination of going, which is chapter 2. So there's no going in that which is being gone on, in that which has been gone on, and that which is not yet being gone on. So whichever part of the path you choose, there's no going on that part of the path. Whether it's the bit that you've already covered, or the bit that you're supposed to be covering now, or the bit that you haven't yet covered. In none of those will you find any going. So in Tsongkhapa's interpretation, that there's no inherently existent going, of course. That's what they mean. Conventionally, you can posit some going, but the kind of going that the opponent wants to posit is inherently existent going, or the kind of going he's got to accept. Since he accepts inherent existence, then this is one of the places where Nagarjuna and Budapalita trap him. You see, there isn't any going because there's no going on in any of the three times. Yeah, so let's look at end note number 2. I kept looking at it this week, trying to think about it, and not feeling sure I've understood it or expressed myself properly. But there's 2 or 3 points of debate that we can, query, that we can think about. So that's page 28 in my paper document. End note number 2, concerning verse 14, no arising in the 3 times. So Chris is here, late as usual.
Hanley can't make it. I forgot to say at the start, she can't make this one because of a job shift.
Oh, she's on duty, is she?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah. So as I said in the chapter, there's two arguments, or two sort of fresh arguments, fresh for me, about against inherent existence, and this is the first one. And then in N number 3, it's still, you know, there were two in that paragraph I just read out. So the other one, that's dealt with in N note number 3. But maybe we won't get there this evening. But you can be looking ahead to that one. So there's two end notes, you know, just directly referring to this verse. But this one is no arising at 3 times. Why there is no presently arising for grasp as an inherent being. So the first reason, no arising apart from the arisen and the unarisen. So we start off just repeating what Budapalita says. Now that which is arising does not arise due to the non-existence of arising apart from the arisen and the unarisen. You see, because it's not so difficult to agree that there's no arising for the arisen. That which is already arisen doesn't arise. That's finished arising. Yeah, so that's the past. We don't look for present arising in the past. And then there's no arising for in the future, that which is not yet begun to arise. So that which is not arising yet, you know, that where the cause and conditions haven't, you know, come together enough for us to say that arising has started or whatever. So so in the future and the past, it's kind of not so difficult to say there is no arising, no present arising. So, but even in the present, you see, even that which is arising, according to Budapalita, see, does not arise. So that's a hard one to refute. The challenge, that's one the opponents are going to insist. That's where there is arising. Look, we can point to something in the present, you know. So that's the difficult one that they're trying to refute now. The other two, past and future, with that's kind of, you know, we assume that that's not so difficult, and don't need to sort of have an end note or anything about that one. Those two. So let's read then. For those who grasp at inherent existence, it is impossible to present a coherent account of action going on in the present. So this is my words, of course, but I'll be quoting Tsongkhapa in a minute. One reason is that there is no arising separate from and occurring in a different time phase, from the two, the already arisen and the as yet unarisen. Yeah, so if there is inherently existent arising, it should be like, you know, you should be able to find it when you look for it. Just as if there's an inherently existent body, you know, you should be able to look amongst the parts and say, well, there it is, you know. But when you look among the body, what do you find? You find, well, you find a hand, you find a leg, you find, you know, belly, or you find backside, or, you know. So, but you never find that body, you know, the body, which is like the thing you're looking for. Okay, so it's going to be like that, I think. So if you're going to find presently arising, you know, that which is arising, you should be able to find it existing by way of its own power, and that would have to be surely separate from what's already arisen and what has not yet arisen. You know, you ought to have the 3 times, and in the middle between the past and the future, there ought to be the present. You know, that ought to be have some sort of own validity, you know, own presence, own entity. But what you find that you don't find anything. There's nothing like which is apart, you know, occurring, you know, sort of independent and without sort of being, you know, without sort of relying on, or I don't know, without being imputed in dependence upon some part of the past and some part of the future, or some part of what has arisen, some part which is not yet arisen. So that's not that's kind of, you know, think, well, there's no kind of, you know, independent validity to presently arising. Then it can't be found existing from its own side, sort of thing. Can't be found ultimately existent. Yeah, so how does that work? Well, we did discuss it a bit last week, and so, but it's quite a tricky kind of issue, quite a tricky thought, really. If we haven't really, it's quite a fresh argument for me anyway, when I discovered it. So when there is arising from causes, the arisen and unarisen are directly contradictory. So in general, we would say that, the arisen and the unarisen are directly contradictory. So that doesn't just mean they're contradictory. There's nothing which is both of those. But directly contradictory means, like, there's no third alternative. But whatever it is, it would have to be either arisen or unarisen, whatever, or let's say whatever compounded phenomena, yeah? Well, if it is a compounded phenomenon, it can be unarisen. Yeah? But it's like, anyway, those two are directly contradictory, like permanent and impermanent. I'm just explaining that. That is to say, if it is not one of the two, arisen or unarisen, it must be the other one. And there's no case of being either arisen, both arisen and unarisen. As a further example of directly contradictory, if it exists, it must either be permanent or impermanent. If it is not one, it must be the other. Being directly contradictory is a case of either X or non-X. There is no third possibility. So what do you think, Yael? If it exists, is it necessarily either arisen or unarisen?
I accept.
Yeah. If it exists, is it necessarily arisen?
I accept. Arisen.
Subject to unclosed space, it follows it is arisen.
I accept.
You accept, did you say?
Yes. Yes.
Jimpa, it's subject to unclosed space, it follows it is arisen.
Why?
The subject unclosed space, it follows it's not arisen.
Accept.
It's not arisen because
Because it's permanent.
it's permanent, yeah. So if it's permanent, it's necessarily not arisen.
Accept.
Yeah, it seems like arisen might be, makes you think of arisen from cause and condition. So that would only be the impermanent phenomena. So in that case, permanent would be unarisen. It exists, but it's not arisen from cause and conditions. But is it a dependent arising? Everything's a dependent arising. If it's a dependent arising, it doesn't mean if it exists, it has to have arisen then. But not arisen from cause and conditions. Dependent arising, denjung, dependent arising. Yeah, so I mean, if you say everything is a dependent arising, which if that sounds like you should say that, then even permanent phenomena should be dependent arising. In which case, doesn't that mean it is arisen? So I'm not quite sure what to say about that. Just occurs to me. Anyway, that needn't it doesn't interfere with our argument here. Just to say that being directly contradictory is a case of either X or non-X. There's no third possibility. That seems to be kind of important here to understand that it's got to be one or the other, arisen or not arisen. But yeah, it's a little bit kind of uneasy about my understanding. Anyway, we'll see where the problems come up. So there is no presently arising for the arisen, for it has already arisen and ceased arising. Similarly, there is no presently arising for the unarisen, i.e. for that which is yet to arise. But, you know, if you think about it, so what do you think? Is there a common base of arising and not arisen? It is arising, but it's not arisen. Yeah, I need to modify my statement there. There is no presently arising for the arisen, for it has already arisen, ceased arising. That's okay. Similarly, there's no presently arising for the unarisen, that which is yet to arise. But is it something which is arising but not yet arisen? What do you think, Thomas? Is there common locus of arising and not yet arisen?
Common locus of arising and not yet arisen.
Yeah.
Except
For example?
the clay pot at the time of the time prior to the clay pot before clay pots have arisen.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear you. Sorry, say again.
So clay pot at the time when clay pot is arising and not yet arisen.
Yeah, so you can say, well, there is a time when clay pot could be arising but not yet arisen. For us, you know, for the consequentialist, I'm not sure that that's so easy for the other schools to say that once you kind of examine their clinging to inherent existence. But yeah, you think, I mean, it sort of, to me, it seems that there is something which is arising and not yet arisen. You know, is there something which is being read and not yet read? Like the book I'm reading now, for instance, yeah. The book is being read by me, but I haven't finished it yet. So it's not yet read. So, you know, what I wrote there is like, I'm not quite sure whether that's cool. Is there a common base of that which is present arising and that which is not yet begun to arise? So that would be the future, something which is not yet begun to arise, you know. The cause and conditions maybe are there, but they haven't started to interact, yeah. Like you have eggs in your refrigerator, and you have your kind of, you have oil in your cooking in your kitchen, and you have a pan, and you have gas. You could make an omelette if you wanted to. You know, you've got no plan to make one right now. So the omelette has not yet begun to arise, even though the cause and conditions are kind of, you know, available if you want to make one. Not develop the intention. So there is something which is, you know, there's nothing which is arising and has not yet begun to arise. But you might say there's something arising and not yet arisen. Or is there, you know? So I'm wondering about that. I'm thinking about Tom Copper's comment. But, anyway, so we'll see how we get on. Anyway, that becomes a big issue. You know, there's something sort of I'm not quite sort of sorted out there. But maybe we should just look at. Wait a minute. if we can just look back at page 12, where we're talking about verse 14, yeah? So this is the paragraph immediately under where he repeats 14 CD. So it's a bit we've already read last week. So he repeats the last line and a half of the root text. And then he says, well, the first bit of the paragraph is about something in the past. Yeah, there's no arising for something in the past, because in something in the past, the action of arising is already finished. But then the second half of the paragraph, the last part of the paragraph is saying, it says, nor does the unarisen arise. So that's on the fourth line. Nor does the unarisen arise. Why? Due to its non-existence. What that is unarisen will arise. And if a non-existent may arise, then a hare's horn may arise. A hare's horn may also arise. But it does not arise, so the unarisen does not arise either. So that's Budapalita's way of dealing with it. So it still makes you think, well, why doesn't the unarisen arise? Because it doesn't exist. So the clay pot before it's produced, the clay pot that Thomas brought in, the clay pot before it's produced, does it arise? No, because it doesn't exist. But does that mean in order for something to arise, it has to exist? But it doesn't arise until it's arisen. It doesn't exist until it's arisen. So maybe, Budapalita is using the argument against people who cling to inherent existence. If something inherently exists, and as we said several times in this course, then the consequence of that is that it has to exist at the time of its own arising. And the reasons we gave for that was something like, when you have this dependent relationship and two things are inherently existent, then they have to exist at the same time. They're inherently dependent and dependent upon. Then the only way that they are inherently dependent and dependent upon is if they, the only way is then they have to exist both at the same time. If one is inherently dependent on the other, then it's dependent on the other at all times. So whenever one exists, then the other has to exist. Whenever the one doing the depending exists, then that which it depends upon also has to exist, because the dependent inherently exists upon the dependent. But inherently means it's in the very nature of the first one to depend on the second. So there's no way the first exists except if the second one is there. So that means they end up having to exist simultaneously. So the arising of effects upon causes, it becomes impossible if you are claiming inherent existence at the same time. So if you take that as an argument against the other schools, the lower schools who are clinging to inherent existence, it kind of works, There's got to be, if there's an action of arising going on, there's got to be something doing the arising, the agent doing the action of arising. And those two are, dependent and dependent upon. There's an agent, something which is arising, and there's the action of arising. No action of arising without something which is arising. And nothing arises without the action of arising. So those two are inherently dependent and dependent upon. So that once they're inherently dependent and dependent on, then they both have to exist. But at the time of the unarisen, the time when the clay pot is unarisen, there is no clay pot. So there can't be any rising of a clay pot because, you know, without one, you aren't going to have the other. In inherently existent terms, they both have to be simultaneous. So, you know, maybe we should interpret Budapalita of, you know, he's saying and making an argument which applies to, you know, it defeats the opponent, but it doesn't apply to us because we just accept, you know, merely imputed dependent arising. We can merely impute that the pot is arising before it comes into existence. We can say, look, the pot's arising just when we watch the potter working on the wheel. But we, you know, there's no problem about the pot having to be there because it's just arising, you know, in the perspective of our own consciousness. It doesn't have to be arising, you know, the pot doesn't have to be there doing its own arising for us. So that's one way to take it. Taking unarisen and arisen and unarisen to be mutually, you know, directly contradictory, then that seems to be the way you have to take it. And there's some, you know, like yeah. Well, anyway, so that's how Budapalita deals with it. You see, if you say, does the arisen, is there any arising for the unarisen? And he's saying no. But we had that, you know, we've just said that, you know, there could be a common base of arising and unarisen, something that's in the process of arising. So there's a, you know, it's not quite clear whether what we're saying is valid or it's just valid on a conventional level, but not for the opponent or what. So yeah, I'm sorry to be so unclear, but I've been thinking about this over the week whenever I've had time, and you know, it doesn't just sort of come easily clear. But you know, there's a lot that we can say in spite of our kind of, you know, problem parts. So there are presently arising for the unarisen, I wrote there, i.e. for that which is yet to arise. So actions such as eating or reading are the same. So whether you're saying arising is the action that's going on, or eating or reading, it's just the same. The act of eating is completed when the food is swallowed. There again, in fact, in keeping with the fact that eaten and non-eaten are directly contradictory, there are only those two possibilities. So there's no food being eaten separate from the has been eaten and the so far uneaten. We didn't have this example last week. We had reading, didn't we? Last week we had reading, knitting. Do you remember? So we had those issues, those discoveries that when you're talking about reading, well, he says, well, you've got what you've read and what you've not yet read. So you're reading a book. You've read the first 2 chapters. Well, you read the first 2.5 chapters, let's say. But the second half of the second chapter and the other chapters you've not read. So on the basis of that, you say, well, I'm reading this book, you know, it doesn't mean you exactly have to be reading it now, but you're working your way through the book. And, you know, you've not put it down and forgotten it, you know, you're going to come back to it. So in your mind, you can say, yeah, I'm reading that book. And it's, everybody would say that's a perfectly valid way to talk. But when you examine it, you've got that which you've read and that which you haven't read. And if you go down to, you know, the chapter level, yeah, well, I've read the first half of the chapter, not the second half. You go down to the page level, yeah, the same. Yeah? But I've read the first half of the page, but I haven't got to the end of the page yet. So you can go down to the paragraph level, you know. I've read the first 2 sentences of the paragraph, but not the last 2 sentences. Yeah, even the sentence. I've read the first 3 words of the sentence, and then the telephone rang. I stopped reading or something. But I can remember what the first 3 words of the sentence were. But I have no idea what came next. So it's like that. Whatever you say, well, I'm reading the sentence, I'm reading the paragraph, I'm reading the page. It always seems to come down to something that you have read and something that you haven't read. So there's no reading. There's nothing which you are reading separate from the read and the not yet read. The read and the not yet read being directly contradictory. Everything, everything. There's got to be one of those two. So where's the bit that's being read then? Well, it's there, but it's sort of unfindable here. But the only way it exists is some sort of conventional existence. There's nothing there from its own side. If you can put theirs, there it is. It's only merely imputed in dependence upon something which has been read and something that has not yet been read. So yeah, you've got basis of imputation, just like you've got arm or leg or hand or, 2 legs, 2 arms, the body and head and stuff. Then, the main part of the body, the trunk, let's say. Oh yeah, that's the body then, that's my body. But then sort of, a perspective of the mind, taking those parts and seeing them as a whole. So here you take the parts, the not yet read and the read, and you carve out of those. You say, that's what I'm reading. And eating is the same. Yeah, you might think, oh well, eating's different because there is something I'm actually eating now. And you've got your mouth full of food and you're chewing it. So isn't that the bit I'm eating? Yeah, there's a bit of food on my plate. There's a bit that's gone into my stomach. For my supper or something. But there's a bit I'm actually eating in my mouth. Isn't that the bit I'm eating now? Yeah, so there is something I'm eating, the food that's in my mouth right now that I'm chewing. But still somebody can say, yeah, well, so let's say that the boundary between eaten and not eaten is if you've swallowed it or not. Which is fair enough, I think, if a kid chews some food he doesn't like and then he spits it out, you wouldn't say he's eating it, would you? The kids say, oh, I did eat it. And the mother says, no, you didn't eat it. You spat it out. You chewed it a bit, then you spat it out. I saw you. So then the mother wouldn't accept that the child had eaten that food. Just the child is being naughty or something, or just doesn't like the food. The mother wouldn't accept the child's eaten the food unless it actually swallowed it and then gone down. But still, it's got to be either eaten or not eaten. So the food in the mouth is not yet eaten because the act of eating hasn't been completed. So that seems to be something, even something eating, it seems to be still, when you say I'm eating it, I'm eating my supper, half of it's, or a bit of it's gone down into your stomach, so that's eaten, and a bit of it is not yet gone out to your stomach, and that's the not eaten. So on the basis of some of it being eaten, some of it not being eaten, you say, oh, I'm eating my supper. So it is, wherever you look for, oh, that's this thing I'm eating, then, but still, it still breaks down into that which has been eaten and that which has not been eaten. But it still has to be imposed, or like imputed, or like carved, just shaped by the mind or chosen by the mind on the basis of what's not been eaten, what has been eaten. Yes, but there is something I'm actually eating. The bit that's the act of eating has arisen, but it's not yet finished. That's the bit that I'm eating. Yeah, but according to Tsongkhapa, it still comes down to half eaten, half not eaten, and that's what the analysis seems to be. So Tsongkhapa's Ocean of Reasoning commentary following verse number 1.4. So this is his commentary on verse 14, not a commentary from this chapter, but as I say, these arguments have come up earlier, and one place they come up is in this this chapter about going. The analysis of going is the going on the been gone on that which is being gone on now, or that which is yet to be gone on. And so there's no going in any of those 3 times, you see. And that's chapter 2. It's all about that. I mean, that'll be one argument. There'll be other arguments against going as well. but that's maybe one of them, maybe in the first one in the chapter. Can't remember. So I did look at those because, you know, that's where you're supposed to look to get sort of more detail on this question, because he says, yeah, it's just like when I was talking about the going and gone on and so forth. So you look in there, so you do find, yeah, a discussion of it. But this particular argument, like there's no going in the 3 times, or there's no happening in the 3 times, there's no arising in the 3 times, does seem to come also in verse in chapter number 1. So if you want to get the lowdown on this, yeah, you go back to chapter 1. Examination of conditions. So I did that as well. Translated some verses from there, puzzled over them. So what it says what Tsongkhapa says here in verse number 1, verse number 4 of chapter 1, the commentary there seems very similar to what you know, the argument that's applying that Nagarjuna and so on are mentioning it for verse 14 of chapter 7. So what does Tsongkhapa say about chapter 1, verse number 4 then? If it is asserted the action of arising is found in that which is in the process of arising, that is also untenable. You see, there's no arising in the arisen, there's no arising in the yet to arise. Okay, those two are eliminated, they're refuted, but the opponent, of course, thinks it could be arising in that which is in the process of arising. So where else would you find it? This is obviously the position they would hold. But Tsongkhapa says, no, that's also untenable, because there is nothing which is arising that is neither arisen nor unarisen. If you want inherent arising, you've got to show it, you've got to be pointed. There it is from its own side. You know, that's something which is arising. But all you got to do, all you're going to find is something which is arisen and not arisen, a bit of each. And then you'll impute it. Oh yes, I'm reading that page. I'm reading this chapter. I'm reading this book, you know, because I'm halfway through it. That's all you're saying. But there's nothing which actually is being read. But that's not his example, that was my example. So he's got another example, which isn't necessarily an easy example to understand. But the opponent, you see, he's trying to make his thoughts clear then. What about an action of arising that has begun, but the arising is not complete? It's neither finished arising, nor is it unarisen. The action of arising utterly be unbegun. Yeah? So it's not finished arising, nor is it something that's unarisen where the action of arising is utterly unbegun. So now he's being specific, or in this occasion, the opponent, when he says unarisen, it means something that has not begun to arise. Okay? That's like really, that's like real future. It's not like something which is arising but is unarisen. But where he's using arisen there, it's either finished arising or it's unarisen in the sense of arising hasn't begun yet. And so the cause and conditions might be there, like the eggs in your fridge, and the oil's in the bottle, and the frying pan is in the cupboard, and the gas is not working. The gas is not burning. But you could easily make an omelette, but there's no, the omelette's not arising yet. So that's where it's the action of arising utterly unbegun. So eliminate those two, the finished arising and where the action of arising is utterly unbegun, and then in between that you've got that which is arising. Yeah? The action of arising has begun, but the arising is not complete. So that's arising. That is something which is arising, and this action should be thought of that. You know, the action that thing is doing, that's arising. But Tsongkhapa's absolutely having none of that. This is also untenable. The base being designated in saying this is arising, consciousness, for instance. Yeah, so he picks a sort of a bit of a, I don't know, is it a tricky subject or not? We could say sprout or something, you know. But he says, I pick something like sprout or an omelette, but he picks consciousness. which might have problems of its own. I don't know. So he says, you know, let's say consciousness, there's a consciousness which is arising then. So if we posit that one as our basis of our discussion, you know, consciousness, for instance, is posited as that which is arising. Okay, we're talking about consciousness which is arising. But if some part of it has arisen and some part not arisen, then it will be half arisen and half unarisen. So there will be nothing that is neither of the two, arisen or unarisen. So even consciousness, you see, he's splitting into two. There's a bit that's arisen, a bit that's not arisen. So, you know, where's this inherently existent arising going on there? So the bit that has arisen, that's finished arising. And the bit that hasn't arisen yet, that's not finished arising. But if you try to say, well, that's what's arising, something that's already finished arising in the first part, but the second part's not finished arising yet, and you say, you know, well, how are you going to say that then? If it is thought of as that as both having finished and not finished arising, that seems very wrong. Yeah, half of it's arisen, half of it's not arisen. So that thing, like consciousness, you know, the consciousness which is half arisen, half not arisen, you know, that's a common locus of having finished arising and not finished arising. But that's ridiculous, you know. You can't have a common locus of something which has finished arising and not finished arising. Okay, the first half has arisen, the second half not arisen. But you can't then say that, well, that thing, that it has both finished arising and not finished arising. That's ridiculous. They're completely contradictory. So the finished arising is in the past, and that which is not yet finished, you know, that which is not yet arisen is in the future. And so you're going to get all those three times completely mixed up if you try to, you know, claim that something which is half arisen, half finished arising, and half not arisen is arising, you know, from its own side. So that's not going to be very satisfactory. But what does it mean by, you know, a consciousness which is half arisen and half not arisen? So that's troubling to me. A consciousness is arising. So why do we say that? I don't know. Like, does it mean it by time? Like we have a consciousness that lasts for 5 minutes, and 2.5 minutes has passed. So half the consciousness is, you know, it's been around for half the time, but it's going to last for another 2.5 minutes. Is that what it means? You know, say you've been in lockdown, you know, you haven't been allowed out of your house or something, you haven't been allowed to walk into the countryside, something like that. You can only walk, you know, 500 meters around your house or something, which is what they do in Italy. There's some sort of lockdown, which is quite tight. You know, and not really allowed to go more than 500 meters from your house or something, even if you're just taking exercise, you know, unless you've got some real serious purpose, you know, you've got an actual thing to do. But if you are just taking exercise, you're supposed to stay near your house. Okay, so the lockdown finishes, then you can go out in the country, you know, you can have some nice fresh air and it's a nice day. So you, just like a guy came out of prison, you know, you're out and, you know, enjoying the fresh air and it's the sunshine. So you have a consciousness of pleasure, let's say, a pleasure, you know, a feeling of pleasure, you know, a feeling of enjoyment, which lasts 5 minutes because of your having a nice walk in the fresh air after a long time. It might last for 5 minutes before you start thinking about something else, you see. So you can have a consciousness of pleasure lasting for 5 minutes. So when you're 2.5 minutes into that 5 minute episode of pleasure, then is that what he's talking about? Is half arisen and half not arisen? So the first part of the consciousness has arisen, but the second part hasn't arisen yet. I mean, that's my best idea. Or you can say, well, none of the consciousness has arisen at all yet. It's just in the process of arising. You know, you're having some sort of mental stimulation, but you haven't got to the point of actually feeling anything yet. You know, so the consciousness of the feeling of pleasure hasn't even arisen yet, even the first moment of it, you know. So the consciousness half arisen means that, you know, you're halfway to having the first moment of the consciousness. But somehow I don't think that's what he means. But you know, you have to think about it. So what do you think, Tim? Has the year 2021 arisen yet?
It's not inherently arisen, but it's conventionally it's arisen.
The subject, the year 2021, it hasn't arisen because it is still arising.
I think don't accept that, because when the 1st of January came around, we were in the year 2021 at that from then on.
Yeah,
I don't think you can say it's arising. It's arisen at that point.
Well, if the year 2021's arisen, doesn't that mean that the whole 365 days have to have arisen?
If I write the day, when I write the date down, I write 2021. So that's me. I'm in 2021. I don't think the future doesn't have to. The future doesn't exist. That part.
So the year 2021 has 365 days, or 366. No, 365 days. It's like any other ordinary year except for a leap year.
Yeah.
So for the year 2021 to have risen, and those 365 days have to have risen.
If the whole year had arisen, would then be in the year 2022.
Yeah, tell me to say, yeah, the year 2021, at least it arose, you know. At least it even if it's finished now.
It would have to, yeah. It would have, for it to be complete, for the last second to arrive, we'd then be on New Year's Eve, and it would be the fireworks would have gone off, and we'd be in 2022.
Yeah, so that's right. So if you take it like I'm saying you should take it, then as soon as it's arisen, then it's gone.
It's gone, yeah.
On to a new year then.
That's true.
The arisen is finished. But
if it has to be completely arisen, then 2022 would not have arisen until the following 365 days later, and that would then arise, and it would arise and gone in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, so the year 2021 started arising. It is arising. It's partly arisen and partly not arisen. I mean, that if you understand what Tom Carper's saying, he's talking about consciousness, which is also something you measure through time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, I think that's what he's saying. But I'm not sure. This consciousness of pleasure lasts for 5 minutes. You see. After 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, you're halfway through. So it's half arisen, half not arisen.
Yeah.
Well, you can say it's arriving. Because there's still some arising still to go yet. Some has happened and some is, you know.
If you've got an external object though, so a visual consciousness would arise, assuming that there is some time lag from the external for the sense data to arrive and the visual consciousness to arise. So could you say that consciousness was in the process of arising while that process was going on?
Sort of a time lag between the actual object doing its thing and the consciousness being aware of it, sort of thing.
Yeah, and the brain takes time to process things. So,
well, that's another problem too. Yeah, it's actually arisen, but we haven't realized it yet because our brains always, our minds are a little bit behind what's actually happening in the outside world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's the same.
Some carbon has consciousness, so that's not something in the outside.
True.
Particular
You can say the
example.
same about reading a book. When you're reading a book, whilst the brain is processing the data, the shapes of the letters, and making sense of it, are you then in the process of reading? Isn't?
Yes, but it still comes down to what you have read and what you haven't read. If you're still in the process of reading it, that means it hasn't been read yet.
Yeah, fair enough. It's the okay. As soon as the brain makes sense of it, and then it's been read.
When you've understood the meaning of the word or something.
Yeah, but that's different from something that you say you read last week. Because
well, if you've just read it in the last half second, that's still in the past, though. You know, oh, you've read it now. You've understood the meaning. But now you're no longer reading it.
There's part that there isn't there a part when the brain is making sense of it, which is quite different to something you read, say, a year ago.
But if the brain is still making sense of it, that's not yet read. That's like the bit you haven't even looked at.
It's not yet read.
One bit you've looked
at. Yeah.
Yeah, you're processing it, but you haven't got, you're getting to the meaning. You haven't got the meaning in your mind, so that's not yet read then.
Okay, I agree. It's not yet read, but is it in the process of reading rather than the not yet read? Because when you do understand it, you then would then be read.
Yeah, but as it stands at that particular time, it's not yet read.
I agree. It's not yet read at that point. Yeah.
Point. It's still got a claim to make. Then it's still making a valid claim. It's either read or not read. The bit that you are, you know, the bit you say, well, you're reading now. It's still, even if you just take the word that you're processing, then if you describe it like you're saying, that's part of the not yet read.
I agree. It's part of part of not yet read. Okay, fair enough.
But so that makes it something which isn't being read. Well, does it though? So it's like it's not yet been read, but you are processing it. So some carp is still saying, well, you're basing what you're saying, what I'm reading, it's got to be partly read and partly not read. But you've got this word that you're processing. That's like, yeah, that's the food in the mouth. I'm chewing the food in my mouth. You know, I am eating it.
Yeah.
It's still, you know, then you stand back and say, oh, well, what are you reading then? What are you eating then? Well, I'm eating my supper. Well, I'm eating this mouthful of food, you know. So that's not something which is half eaten and half not eaten, or is it? I don't know.
Well, yeah,
there's half read or not, half read or half not read. So that's what you can say, read the first part of the sentence, but not the last part. This word, whenever there's a word that you're actually processing, it's not like you've read the first two letters and not read the second two letters. It's like you get the word as a whole, don't you? And so they try to, you know, it just comes to your mind as a shape, and you make sense of it without going through the individual letters. We
do now. When we were children, though, we were first learning, it was a much more convoluted process.
Yeah, that's true. When we're learning, we have to do letters one by one. That's true. Yeah, when we are. But nowadays, we, you know, word like you know, on the page, we can pick it up word by word or something. You know, letter by letter. Yeah, so that's, you know, what Sankalpa is actually talking about then is 2001, 2021. Is it arising, or has it already arisen? If you think there is a consciousness which is half arisen, half not arisen, so the best answer I can do to that is to say, well, you have to think of it as an episode of consciousness which lasts for a certain length of time, and half of that length of time is finished. That's the best I can do. You can say, well, even the first moment of the consciousness is not arisen yet. You know, the arising consciousness is like before the consciousness is even the first mode has begun, because you're in the process of, you know, something's coming up from the depths of your mind, which eventually becomes, you know, a lucid, you know, conscious thought, but it hasn't sort of got there yet because it's still working its way up from the depths of your consciousness to something. I don't know. Is that what it means about it? I can't be sure.
Yeah, for the rising of the year, we see sometimes, you know, on TV the fireworks. They say first in Japan and Australia, then the year already began, already has a reason, but not in America. So maybe in this case, it's easier to find something that is not a reason and a reason.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Sankar was thinking like that. But yeah, for them it's arisen, but for us it hasn't arisen. Well, for them it started anyway. For us it's not yet started. Depends where you are in the world.
Geshe-la, can I ask something?
If it inherently arises, it should arise for everybody at the same time. Yes or no? Simple. It inherently arises by its own power. Why doesn't it arise at the same time for everybody?
It should, yeah.
I don't know. Yes, Yale.
I'm just writing. I'm a bit confused with the part that you say that the unarisen, we have the cause and the conditions, the causes and conditions, but they did not interact yet. They are not interacting yet, like your example with the eggs. But when you create a pot and you cut the process of production in the middle and you say half arisen, half not arisen, the causes and conditions are interacting. When you are chewing your food, even if you didn't swallow, causes and conditions are interacting even for the next bite that you didn't chew yet. It's not something that totally didn't start.
Yeah, that's the trouble, you see. If you say the two arising and arisen and unarisen are directly contradictory, you could sort of have to accept that, because they're read and not read. If you want to ask for examples in directly contradictory in Buddhist debating, they would just say something like that. Read and not read, for instance, or permanent and impermanent. So there's definitely there's nothing which is neither of the two. No existing thing. You know, there's no existing thing which is either permanent, which is neither permanent nor impermanent. So every existing thing has to go into one of those two categories. And in terms of read and not read, then even non-existence, you know, they go into the not read category. So everything which is selfless, existent or non-existent, has to go into the read or not read category. There's no third alternative. But then, yeah, if you take the three times, and then you can say yes. So there is a place, there's some which has arisen, and then there's some where the cause and conditions have not yet begun to arise. So that's the future. But there is in between those, there is ones where, you know, like that the opponent says, the action of arising has begun, but it's not complete. But the cause and conditions are interacting, like the food in your mouth, or like the person who's actually mixing the eggs and he's pouring the eggs into the hot frying pan, you know, to make the omelette. You know, you should say the omelette is arising. So you can have three times, like the past, present, and future. So this unarisen and arisen business isn't the whole story. You can make this. You can say there are three possibilities, yeah. And the one in the middle is where, you know, the cause and conditions are interacting, but the thing hasn't come into existence yet. So then something like a sprout, you know, he's conscious, Tom Carper says consciousness, but I'm not a bit sure about, because then you're into these moments of time What does it mean for something to arise like 2021? Does it have to all the years, all the days of the year have to be there? But you take something a bit simpler like a sprout, say. There's a time when the sprout is arising. You know, the cause and conditions are interacting. The seed has got a little bit of moisture and it's a little bit of warmth, and it's sitting there on the windowsill, you know, sort of, you know, getting the sun and on a bit of damp paper, so it's receiving some water, but not too much, you know, so it's getting what it needs exactly. So it starts sprouting, you know, the seeds start swelling, and there's something starts happening, starts changing shape, you know, this little shooty things noticeable. So yeah, so that, okay, that's the seed. That's when the rising is taking place, yeah, and the sprout is arising. But Sankara just comes along, or you know, Nagarjuna, they just say, yeah, well, it's half arisen, half not arisen, isn't it? Anything that's arising, like your sprout, is half arisen, half not arisen, or partly arisen and partly not arisen. You know, like some of the cells which will become part of the, you know, the internal part of the sprout have already grown. And gradually, as you leave it for another 24 hours, then more cells will accumulate from that inner core that's already there, and other cells will pile on top. As it'll get bigger, then it'll get longer and a bit thicker, you know, and sort of start to curl upwards or whatever it does, or curl downwards, because it's, you know, so it'll start changing shape and keep on moving. But some part of it's already arisen, you see. The inner part, or the first cells of that kind of sprout, even if it doesn't look like a sprout, the first cells of the sprout have arisen, and the next cells of the sprout, the external cells, they will come in and kind of arise, sticking to the inner ones that are already there. So you can say, yeah, that is even your one that is arising that hasn't finished arising, but the cause and conditions are interacting. It's still a case of partly arisen, partly not arisen. Therefore, you know, where's the present arising? Where's the thing that's actually arising, you know, by way of its own power, or where's the arising that's happening, you know, in reality? Where's the entity of arising? All you can do is, are you positing arising independence on something which is half arisen, half not arisen? So then there's no arising from its own side in between the arisen and the not yet arisen. So at one point it starts to make sense, but look, thinking about it again, it kind of, you know, you lose your sense.
I accept this dichotomy that either arisen or non-arisen, and then every process, any process, you can divide into these two. I feel uncomfortable with the definition of unarisen as something that the causes and conditions do not interact yet. That was the part that I felt a bit uncomfortable with. Because if you divide any process in the middle, so even for the part that didn't arisen yet, there is interaction there. So for me, this part was a bit confusing.
Yes, I think that's where the confusion is, you see. For me too.
Okay.
Because at one point, arisen seems to mean that which hasn't yet begun to arise. At another point, it seems to mean that which has not yet begun to arise, in the sense of the cause and conditions of work together, but also that part where the cause and conditions are working together. They are interacting, but it's still unarisen. But sometimes unarisen seems to mean just the one that hasn't yet begun to arise. But sometimes it seems to include that where the process of arising has also already begun, but not finished. So I don't know, yeah. So that's where my kind of, you know, bit of confusion is really. So anyway, if we read the rest of the note, right, note number 2. It's nearly 20 to 9. Sorry, I've gone on. Not even got through the note I'm supposed to be reading. Yeah, so there's another half page. I don't know if it's just sort of helpful, but it's kind of, you know, trying to say the same thing, really. Maybe I should just read it now quickly, or you have to go. maybe we save it. We don't want to go on too long. Yeah, so we've exposed some of the difficulties, so I haven't got much clarity, but the rest of the note is just trying to just continue the discussion a bit. Okay, let's stop there then, because